Greetings, everybody. This is Mike Rochelle, and I welcome you to the third season of Growing the Next Version of You. I'm really excited to have my good friend and partner, Bryan Rogers, Esquire, from Cheyenne, Wyoming, joining us today. So, Bryan, how are you and Julie and the kids and everybody doing?
Just doing wonderful, Mike. And, we talk every day about the difference between our two climates. I'm in Wyoming and we're high plains. I'm truly in the Mile High City here. We earned that title more than Denver does, but we're in the 60s today. So cool day, winds out there, breeze, chilly.
Yeah. So it's 101 here. I'm an hour ahead of you with the sunrise. So I'm sending you a picture as I'm watching the sunrise, and it'll be, I think last week on Monday it was 72, which was the lowest it's been since the fall, or since the spring. And today it was 101 degrees, so it's crazy.
It's ironic that our daytime highs are tracking your overnight lows pretty close.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes sense though. If you're a mile high, you're actually above Denver
Yes,
geographically, and you're a little higher than they are as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you get a lot more wind than they do and a lot more cold weather, I think.
We do both. Yeah. We get a lot more wind. So
yeah.
60, 70, 80, 90 in 2008 or 2009. I think we counted 12 days in January that were above 100-mile-an-hour wind. So
goodness,
we were going to work.
Yeah, you can't stop up there, right? Or if you did to wait, then you wouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so the Growing the Next Version of You show is really about my guests and their story, right? So what I'd like to do, Bryan, if it's okay with you, is to kind of go back to your parents, where they came from, kind of the beginnings of who might you be. And then we'll get into faith and family and all the fun stuff as we go along. So if you would, who were your parents? Where did they come from? And how did you come to be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. People ask me a lot of times, where am I from? And I tell this story a lot that when I was 14, I sat down with my brother and sister in the living room, and we were going over all the places that we had lived. And I realized I had lived in 14 places and I was 14 years old. So my dad was an electrical engineer and a troubleshooting engineer. So he worked for NASA, he worked for refineries, he worked for different companies, air conditioning companies, and they had these big projects, electrical control systems. And so when they were behind, they would bring him in to get him back on track. And so he would work himself out of a job, get him on track. And then us kids would know when the phone started ringing a lot that we were probably going to move. So we lived in many different places in Texas. We lived in Iowa. We lived in Florida. We lived in California. We moved around quite a bit. And I still talk to my sister about this today. In many ways, it was really good for us. We learned to make friends quickly. We learned to be adaptive. And, people just would say, didn't you hate it? And I would say, well, no, I didn't. I enjoyed it. I liked all the places we lived and have great memories of all the different places that we went to. So that was us. Mom and dad, dad was Russian speaking until he was 12, but he actually lived in a Czechoslovakian household, and they spoke Russian, and they took the Czech newspaper, which was printed in Russian, and that was in El Campo, Texas. And so his family had immigrated in through Galveston and then settled in El Campo. And if you go in that area to this day, you can find Czechoslovakian restaurants and people who have a Czechoslovakian heritage. And so that's where my dad came from. His dad and his mom divorced when he was young, and at 8 years old, he was taken from that household and brought to his mother's house, who I knew as my grandmother. I really never knew my biological grandfather, and that was to Houston. And she was married at that time to my grandfather Rogers, and so her lineage was Scott Irish. He was Scott Irish. He was a very well-read man, my grandfather Rogers. He was a city court judge in Houston, so he did night court and would go in there, and he would occasionally bring me in with him, and I would watch him as he did what he had to do. And so that was his heritage and his history. He also worked for Dow. He was a painter. He painted signs, and so very interesting and varied in his talents and background and history. And I grew up really close to him. even though he wasn't my biological grandfather, and I didn't even know that till I was much older. But we were very close, and we called him Papa Judge. So I spent a lot of time with Papa Judge during the summers. So Czechoslovakian and Scott Irish on that side, and my grandmother would tell us and regale us with stories of her tracing back the Scott Irish lines to the Rogers, which is a job title, actually stood on the field with William Wallace, so she was proud of that. And a Roger would be someone, when the cavalry would be charging the English cavalry, they would hold a pole. It was actually basically just a small tree trunk, about 4 inches wide with a point on it. And their job was to hold on to that pole and put it into the horse as it charged. And they didn't have weapons or anything other than that. They were just there to slow down the cavalry. So wow. They were Rogers, and they were scrappy. And my grandfather was the 12th of 12 children, and grew up on the south side of Chicago, very scrappy. His oldest brother was shot outside of a arena, and his brother was supposed to throw a boxing match, and he didn't throw it like he was supposed to, so the mob shot him while my grandfather was there, and he escaped by crawling underneath a Model A truck. And so they were scrappy, they fought all the time, and they came by it honestly. So yeah, my mom's side, Choctaw. She grew up in Oklahoma. Her mother grew up in Oklahoma. My grandfather Draper met her and married her there. But my mother was the last of the line that had enough Choctaw in her to receive. There was a thing called the Choctaw Roll. And so it was either like 1/16 or 1/32, and then you could receive some financial benefits for being a part of the nation. And so she was happy with that. And I know she used that to fund some time that she had in business school. And so she went to a business school there in Houston, and was able to use that funding for herself. And so she was proud of that, and mentioned it quite a bit. But she grew up in Houston. My dad was a University of Houston graduate and met her, and they got married, and the rest was history.
Interesting. So Russian speaking on your father's side, did they actually speak Choctaw in her home by the time she was living?
No, and that's interesting that you say that, because we would ask her if she knew any words, and she really didn't. She didn't participate in any of the life of the nation, or she knew some of the history. But it's kind of sad, because there's a rich history there,
right,
of some really significant heritage and many accomplishments that I don't think there was an effort. It was probably the exact opposite. I think the effort over the years and the generations was to diminish that and not preserve it and track it, unless the people of the nation did it for themselves. So yes, no, she didn't even know any words. And that was kind of sad.
Yeah. So I knew both your mom and dad, and Gil and Doris were treasured second parents to me as I was growing up. So your dad actually shares my dad's middle name, Gilbert.
Okay.
My dad's was William Gilbert Rochelle.
I did not know that.
Gilbert was now. No, seriously?
Yeah, seriously. Yeah.
He always went by William. When he was in the service and met my mother in Germany, he was Bill. So I don't think anybody ever used Gilbert other than when he was formally introducing himself, for that perspective.
Wow.
Yeah. So then 16th Choctaw, what was the rest of her lineage?
And so her father was Draper, go straight back to England. Draper was a title. So just came from England, rural England, and immigrated through Pennsylvania. And then I don't know exactly how they ended up down. Immigrated into Pennsylvania, lived there, and then came down to Texas at some point. So they were they really lived the grapes of wrath thing. They were when they were young. He and his brothers were actually picking crops and stuff. And so they left Oklahoma and went to California to pick fruit. And then they heard about all the refineries being built in Southeast Texas, and so they packed up and made it across. But they had an encounter with a dust storm that was sandblasted one side of the car, and had quite a few adventures, but made it back into Texas. And then he just constructed housing and did construction. So when they were first putting in the big refineries, they needed houses for all these people. So he was just building one house after another with his brothers. Yeah.
Interesting. So builders and pickers. My grandparents picked cotton in Groesbeck, Texas when they were kids. That was their deal. And they moved to Houston. That's how we got there. Eventually, my dad was actually the first child born in Houston.
Wow.
And that's how we met you guys. So if you think about then, so I understand where you're coming from a cultural perspective. How about faith basis? Where did you come from, and how did you progress through that experience?
When I was young, I didn't. We didn't have any faith connection. I don't remember when I was very young going to church as a family to any
Right.
place or having any allegiance there. I would spend the majority of my summers with my grandparents, and so those were, the wood-clad traditional white churches with a steeple, and you walked right in the two doors in the front, and noisy church. I can just remember lots of amens and hooting and hollering and getting excited with the pastor. So that was my experience with my grandparents when we would go, and they would get me into Sunday school when we were staying with them during the summer. And so we had that experience, but at some point in our early lives, my mom and dad got associated with the Worldwide Church of God and Herbert Armstrong. So that's how we met you and your family and quite a few of our lifelong friends. And so we were a part of that, and I attended there and ended up actually going to college at Ambassador University as well. And that's where you as well. That's where you and I both met my wife.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually got to meet her before you did, since I was in Big Sandy and you were in California.
Yeah.
At the time, we were great friends and still are. So really enjoyed that, continuing that relationship. So if you think about then, we were Sabbatarian when we were growing up. We knew each other somewhere between 9 and 14. I don't know exactly when we met specifically, but we've always been friends.
Oh, yes.
In university, we were never together during that time. We went through the worldwide experience and then later left it simultaneously, but without knowing that.
Right.
And it was probably about 20 years later that we reconnected again and started kind of like comparing stories and things like that. So when you left Worldwide, then where did you go, and how has that journey been for you?
It was an interesting journey. My wife's family was the largest family in Wyoming, and as a part of that movement, and so she had cousins. She has some ridiculous amount of cousins. I want to say, I may be quoting this low, but like 61 first cousins, and so
wow.
She had a lot of aunts and uncles, and they had a lot of children.
Yeah.
But they were heavily involved in that, and we were involved in college while we were going there in the University of Ambassador University, and Herbert Armstrong passed, and so there was a succession plan, and there were some people taking over after that. I ended up in Florida working for the organization, and I had married Julie, my wife, who's from Wyoming, and she just wanted to be back home, and so we came back to Wyoming, and at that point, the succession plan was resulting in people having quite a bit of differences on how the organization should move forward. So our families all went different directions, her parents and my parents, and I ended up actually serving as a lay pastor in transition as the organization tried to come to grips with the grace and with the full and complete teachings of the New Testament. And so we did that for a few years and worked at it. I mean, it was work. I used to say I would take a bulletproof jacket to church and people would shoot at me because people were upset and there was a lot of transition that was very, very difficult for folks. And so we had some friends, and my wife attended an organization called MOPS, which is Mothers of Preschoolers, that was in our local Berean church, so Cheyenne. And so that church hosted MOPS, and she went there. And every spring, the church has a praise service where they just come and sing for the entire service. It's a really extended service, and usually in February. And so Julie went to that service and cried through most of it. And people were talking to her, and the pastor at that time, Richard Crocker, said, your wife needs, and this is the quote he gave me, a safe place to worship. And so like I said, I was used to wearing a bulletproof vest and contending with people every week, and that was very hard on her. So we resigned our position. We moved over to Berean Church, and she was just able to worship with friends and learn about the Lord and have safety and security in the worship experience. And we've been there ever since. So we've been there 21 years now.
Yeah. Yeah. So somewhere between 2006 and 2010, you had me come out and do some leadership sessions with your group, which was very, very fun for me because I got to meet a lot of your friends from the local congregation and Richard. And we talked a lot about strengths. So he's actually been using strengths for many years to help people identify the place where they should plug into giving within the church body, right? Which is a really powerful way. So is that one of the things that he did for you guys back in the day, or is that something that he added later?
So who is the he? Who are you talking about there?
Richard Crocker.
Okay. Yeah, we had a gift of still to this day, although he's not the senior pastor, he's still a part of the church. He had a gift for developing people, and he wanted to see people developed and allowed to really flourish and live from, as he would say, at the heart that Jesus gave them. And so he identified with strengths and felt like if folks understood that, they could really jump in with both feet and engage fully and completely. And so he was very excited about that. I'll tell you one thing about, you may not know this, but one thing that really impressed everyone when you came and gave a presentation to us. Do you remember the tornado sirens that went off?
Oh, I do, yes.
Yeah, you pulled out your phone, looked at the radar, and you go, well, it's not coming toward us, and continued your presentation. So everyone was, and the sirens are going in the background, and you just kept going. So I thought that was, that showed some security in your sense of self, and you just kept right on going, and pretty soon the sirens turned off, and we just, I think we were getting close to doing our coats of arms or something at that time, and you just led us right through it.
Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, on the way from Denver, I was at Microsoft at the time, and I had a meeting in Denver, I think, and I scheduled to come out to you guys. I was driving up from Denver to Cheyenne, and a tornado had actually come through the road and ripped up some sort of a barn and shredded it across the freeway.
Yeah.
So already on the way there, I was experiencing this 100-mile-an-hour wind that you guys get to experience all the time. It let it go whenever we were there. I think there were several tornadoes that were hovering around the church that night. So I remember not only that, but I think we met with Richard and some people from the camp. What's the name of your camp?
Camp Bernatho on I-80 as you head from Wyoming into Nebraska. It's just past North Platte, Nebraska, and so. It's it's been there 81 years now, and distinguished by a large white lit cross right there by the interstate. But they actually started the camp. It was just woods, and it was really nowhere. And then the interstate came in through it, and as part of the interstate, they would dig up gravel to build the interstate. And so they created this lake on the property. They said, sure, you can get all the gravel you want, and they created a lake on the property. And to this day, that lake is used by the kids to have fun and water ski and slides and trampolines and all kinds of things in the water. So a lot of vision there to do that before there was any interstate.
There's kind of some cool history there too, because it's in North Platte, right? North Platte is the city.
Yes.
It's on the Platte River.
Yes.
Platte River is where the journey of exploration came up as they were on their way to Oregon. So I think there are some campsites and things like that from those times. So it's a cool place.
Sure.
And I was able to go there twice when my boys were young. My oldest is now 23. So he was probably 4 or 5 the first time I went there with him.
That sounds about right.
And then the second, I think that was right. And then 2007 or maybe 8 was the second time we went. And my daughter, who's now 16, was just a baby.
Yeah.
And Arlene came with me that time. So it's fun stuff. So the cool thing about what you and Richard and the church have done with strengths in particular, which I find cool, is to help people understand where they can plug in and become, more of an asset for Christ in their local area. So it's a lot of fun. And I still am friends with Richard on Facebook and see his shenanigans. Oh, wow. He's still cranking around. So let's see. So where do we go from here? So now we've gotten up to the point where you're in a mainstream organization. Do the Bereans have anything that's specifically unique about the way that they look at the world that you would think to offer?
If you were to encapsulate them quickly, you would say they're essentially Baptists that don't have a prohibition against alcohol. Very, very Baptist feel. But heavy emphasis on grace, heavy emphasis on freedom in Christ and seeing people free in Christ, a huge orientation toward the authority and the inerrancy of the word. So, they spend their time in their Bible. So, yeah, that's how they're aligned.
Okay. All right. So, from a career perspective, then you moved from Florida up to Cheyenne because your wife is from there, has 61 cousins and a bunch of family. What did you do career-wise, and how has that career progressed to where you are today?
Sure. I came up thinking I had a lot of database involvement and local area network training, and I thought I would come up and get a gig doing that in Wyoming. And her family was a large construction family and just did a lot of work in the area. And so I just started going to work with them and just loved it. And so we built multi-units, apartments, townhomes, condominiums, primarily in Fort Collins, and commuted every day and went down there and built all these hundreds of units. And we were doing the framing, so we would get them framed up, the windows in, the doors set, and sheathed in, and a roof on them, and the roof sheathing on. Then other crews would follow us. But her father came up building houses kind of like the Levitt system, the Levittown and the Levitt system, building homes on reservations in Nebraska and North Dakota. My wife was actually born in North Dakota, so they would go and build hundreds and hundreds of houses and then move. And so that was translated into a rapid building system that we used when we were building these multi-units. So we would come in and just start rolling, and our goal was to do a unit a day. And we would set up these things really fast. And but he had from the federal government work a very keen orientation toward quality and a real high standard. And even though it was low, what was acceptable building in Fort Collins was lower than that, he still held us to that higher standard. So we would build very fast, very high quality buildings. And I did that for about 8 years. And then I came off a 2-story roof, and I was grateful because it was spring. I fell off the roof and I fell into a snowdrift, and I was really happy, but the skylight window that I was carrying fell on top of me. And so that was the unhappy result of it. But I just realized it was a young man's game. And I had a friend of mine who worked for Flying J Travel Plazas and was looking for some help. And he said, "Why don't you come work for us?" And so I got on for Flying J and worked there about 8 years and helped them with environmental issues and construction nationally. And then I also had a region that was Montana and North Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. And so traveled around to a lot of beautiful country, looking over stores, and then also helping them do construction projects, because they were the largest diesel retailer in the world at that time, and really growing. And unfortunately, J. Cole died in a plane wreck. He was an incredible pilot. He could fly jets. He had 10,000 hours in a commercial jet, which is a lot of commercial pilots don't have that much time, and could fly helicopters, and he did rescue operations. And he was flying a friend to the Mayo Clinic who had cancer, and something went wrong. And many people thought it had to have been like a cardiac arrest or something, but he perished in the crash. And it was a privately owned company, and the family wasn't ready for that. And so the company just changed overnight, and the culture just completely changed. And so I said, well, this isn't for me anymore, and started doing some consulting and getting involved in different environmental issues. And I had a friend who was an attorney who we both coached our boys when they were 12 in baseball. And so we had a lot of fun coaching baseball. And he kept saying, you need to go to law school. You need to become a lawyer, and you need to do this. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And I did know that I had worked with a lot of lawyers in the past, and I thought, hey, wait a minute, this might be something I could do. But he finally convinced me. And in order to go to law school, you have to take a test called the LSAT. So it's more of a thinking test than an actual knowledge test, and it presents you with problems. And so I signed up too late for an LSAT and got in and went and sat on that in Colorado and took it and did okay. And then I took my results to the University of Wyoming and turned in an application too late and made the waiting list of all things. And so it was just a few days before school was to start. I drove over to Laramie, the University of Wyoming. It's about 50 miles west of Cheyenne, and I met with the dean of students, and I told her, hey, if anyone doesn't work out, I can still come on. And they take about 80 students a year in that law school. And so sure enough, on the Wednesday of the first week, two students took their books to the library and walked out the front door and said, we're not coming back. So I wasn't the first student on the waiting list, but I was the only one that could show up. And so they called me on Thursday and said, do you want to come? And I said, sure. And the way law school works is you actually are reading and studying before the first week. Law school's the Socratic method. So the teachers just fire questions at you and see what you know about the cases. And so I was way behind. Didn't have books, didn't have anything, but there were students that were photocopying cases for me and students helping me get oriented. And they were just grand people and helped me get going. And I really relied on, they were young and full of energy and they could study 24 hours a day. And I had 3 teenagers in the house and one that wasn't a teenager. And I had experience though. And I had done, business and contracts and energy law. And I'd been involved in all this stuff. So I had a lot of experience. That was a big help for me. And that allowed me to make it through. And I got out of law school and passed the bar. And they allow me to put ESQ after my signature now.
Aha, very good.
Yeah.
So with that, then you actually do some, from my perspective, some pretty interesting work. I call you a court advocate. I don't know if that's the exact terminology, but how do you explain what it is that you do in that regard? That's not the only law that you practice, but that is one of the things that you do. And I think it would be interesting for people to understand what that is and how you do it.
Well, Wyoming is not densely populated. So, we have hundreds of thousands of people instead of millions. And our entire state would probably be a couple of 3, 4 subdivision areas of Dallas. So as an attorney, it's really hard to specialize and say, I'm just going to do one kind of law.
Right.
Because there's not that many people. And so you generally set up a general practice unless you hire on with a big firm. And I didn't want to hire on to a big firm. So I adopted a general practice. So doing everything from construction disputes and landlord tenants and domestic law. And the only thing I didn't do was criminal law. So, but anything on the civil side, and took trials to jury and presented things to juries and insurance claims and things like that. But as I just matured in my practice, I really identified with 2 different areas that I really seemed to flourish in. And the first was mediation. So I would mediate disputes. I mediate disputes between all kinds of people and high-level people and just regular folks. And I enjoy the mediation work. And then the advocate part that you're talking about is I work as a guardian ad litem. So I work as a representative of the court to represent the best interest of children when the parents have a dispute. And my wife assists me on that. She's able to engage with me and be a part of that. And it really has been satisfying to not only be engaged and be able to do something that we feel we're talented for and good at, but also for the greater good. We feel like we're making our community a better place. We feel like we're really assisting families to move forward in a positive way. And that's been our experience. And so we enjoy that work. I mediate all the mediations that come my way, and then I fill in with the guardian ad litem work. And we always have cases going and do that work and enjoy it.
Very cool. So there was actually a show. It was I think it ran for about 7 years. It was called The Guardian. Did you ever see it?
People tell me, my son especially, he always wanted me to watch Better Call Saul. And he would say, Dad, you've got to watch this. You'll just really love this. And my life has a lot of drama in it. So I generally don't watch much entertainment. I don't watch much television at all. If we do, my wife and I just love disc golfing. We've disc golfed all over this country, and we try to do it as often as we can. And so I will watch the disc golfing pro tour. I'll stream that and watch that. But other than that, I have not watched any legal series or anything like that because it's just, I deal with it every day and I want something different when I'm being entertained.
No, I understand. So it's for me, it's kind of eye-opening because it's about there's a not-for-profit that is responsible to the court for providing guardians. So they have multiple lawyers in this. It's a nonprofit practice,
Sure.
and there are kids that have either been neglected or abused or whatever their situation is, and then the guardian is the person that's responsible to the court for providing them with guidance and also helping them to achieve their goals. Right?
Sure.
So is that a reasonable way of thinking about it?
Yeah, it is. You know, it's I didn't really know where the series was going to go as you were explaining it.
Yeah.
There's one of the things that being in this area of law makes you appreciate is how good you have it, because there are a lot of
Yeah.
families, a lot of people that don't have it good,
Right.
and there's a lot of crisis out there. And so, I think looking from the outside, people think that when there's neglect or abuse in a situation, or when there's poverty, or when there's challenges that families are trying to overcome as they in their relationships, that somebody needs to be punished and somebody needs to be corrected and set right. And one of the things that Julie and I, my wife, have really come to realize is what those people need is investment and direction and care and concern. And that's the real solution. The real solution to a situation where people don't know how to parent is to help them and encourage them so that they can parent. It's
Right.
Being punitive isn't going to help the child. They don't.
Right.
I mean, they may know that mom or dad spent some time in jail, but it doesn't help them. So we really frame our mind towards how can we help? How can we truly do things that have a lasting impact and a lasting effect for the good? It doesn't always happen, and sometimes you're
Sure.
disappointed. But if we go in with that framework every time, we get more results that are good than if we went in saying somebody's got to be called out as wrong and made to pay. So, but it's hard work.
Yeah. Well, I for one appreciate what you do, and I know that the kids, even if they don't know that they appreciate it, will appreciate it later.
We practice with several things in mind, but one of them is, we're in a smaller community, and
Yeah.
you got 50, 60,000 people here that live around us. And so we see a lot of these people either in the store or out on a soccer field or at a basketball tournament. And I've always said that I want to practice in such a way that when these 8, 9, 10, or 16-year-olds are at the soccer field and they've got their own kids, I can look them in the eye and tell them I did the best for them.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes we have to have some hard conversations with teenagers and say, you don't really understand, but we're working for what's best for you. And you have to earn their trust. But I do want to be able to look them in the eye, and I do want to be able to see them and greet them and not have to run the other way if I see them in a grocery aisle.
Right. So you and I share a mindset in that regard, in that there are things that will lead to a life of fulfillment and of joy and of happiness and of growth, and there are ways of being that are neglectful and difficult and hurtful and produce less than stellar results. So how do you in this process that you're describing, are you able to lay out what those options are as far as what that potential path, the glide path, I guess is the way to think about it, of life for these kids and also for their parents, because you're not trying to necessarily disconnect them from the parents. You're trying to help them to create a better path forward. So
Yeah, no, our objective, we're not law
that?
enforcement. Right. Our objective, we're not law enforcement, so we're not separating children from parents. So our goal is to represent their best interest, is what our charge is from the state. But that is under the paradigm of a continuing relationship. And so if the parents are separating, either married or unmarried, but if they're separating and you're trying to come up with schedules and routines and how to handle holidays and summer and all that, you're trying to really, and I explain this when I come on board with people, I'm trying to maximize the time the child has with each parent, both in terms of quantity, but also in quality. And so we take a lot of things into consideration, where they work and what they do and what their schedule looks like, to really provide for the families the chance for the children to receive investment, not only from the parents, but I also think in terms of the extended family, grandparents, aunties, and uncles can really contribute a lot. And we believe that children today really need all the help they can get. So if we can maximize that, we try to do all that we can. And then in terms of just the opportunity, it's not as clinical as some people might imagine. We do spend time in court. I know all the judges and spend a considerable amount of time in trial, but a lot of our work is in people's homes. So we'll visit the children, our clients, in both parents' homes, and we'll be able to talk to the parents. And, one of the things that we do, and as part of my sort of mental checklist, is if this family is separated because mom and dad were fighting all the time, and maybe there was some destruction of the household or domestic violence, and just this constant chaos and turmoil, we'll have a conversation and talk to both parents and say, hey, this is not a normal, healthy family. What you're doing is not healthy, and it shouldn't be normal. This kind of stuff is abnormal and unhealthy. And so let me talk to you about what a family environment would look like where it would be good for the kids. And what's, I guess, surprising for me, because I had a childhood that wasn't plagued with domestic violence and chaos and a lot of things, was how many people are surprised even at the concept that this isn't normal. In fact, they think they're going to go find, if they're ending one relationship, they're going to go find another relationship, and it's going to look like that. So Julie and I try to communicate a better way for them to relate to their children and to relate to each other after they're separated. And, people are receptive. I've never had anyone blow me off. I've had people listen carefully, and we try to be kind and gentle and instructive, and try to give them things that are practical.
Yeah.
Tell them how to communicate and how to interact. And so that's how we approach it.
Very cool. So from a mediation perspective, then, do you take that same approach? Is it a different mindset, or how do you deal with that?
When I mediate, you're usually working with people who maybe they weren't married, and so it's a custody issue alone, and you're trying to help them work through a custody schedule and all that. If they're married, they're also going to be dividing assets and debts. If it's two contractors, then you might be working out a contract dispute. If it's landowners, then you might be working out different things. But what I'm trying to do is help people come to a result that they may not necessarily like, but they can live with, and teach each other how to treat each other with respect and dignity along the way, voice concerns, voice issues in an appropriate way, and then resolve those issues. So I'm just a problem solver.
Right.
In a mediation. That's what I'm doing: problem solving. I'm also doing that in the guardian ad litem work. I'm problem solving there too, but it's much more coaching and instruction and direction. Although there is coaching, I've sat down with some hard-nosed contractors and said, hey, you keep talking like that, we're not going to get anywhere. And I said, why don't you say this? Well, how about we present what you're trying to say this way, rather than you dirty, no good loser, why don't we just say, hey, I was harmed by what you did, and this is how I think we can make it right. Well, okay, but more problem solving in the mediation environment with some coaching. And then our approach in the guardian ad litem environment is to be coaching. And we're just invested in that greater good. We want to make their lives a better place. And if we do it in enough families and enough households, then we're making our community a better place. And the community's big. We go to North Dakota and Mississippi and Florida, because when parents split up, they often move. Right. So we're benefiting other communities as well.
Sure. Do you want to go that I haven't taken us to in particular?
It's important to me that I not only develop who I am and my knowledge and but my relationships that can help accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. So, there are relationships like you that are important because we're heading in the same direction.
Right.
And so that's the main thing in terms of just me personally. I choose not only who I associate with in terms of people that I think can contribute in the same direction I'm going. I choose that because I relish it and enjoy it. I also kind of like Lex Friedman in that way. Some of my best friends have been dead a long time. I try to read and gain from his history and the things that I read from other folks that I believe are trying to accomplish the same thing. So that's about the only area I can think is just that inside of me network, and then the actual network of people that I try to spend time with.
Yeah. I'm coming to there's probably 3 to 5 people that you have in your life that are kind of going in the same direction, even though we all have our unique path, right? But we can share in that stuff. So did you see the I don't know if you may have been driving back from your wedding yesterday or the day before, but I sent you a recording of somebody reading The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis.
I didn't read it. I just haven't had a chance.
But
No.
whenever you have a chance to listen to it, it's like, I think it's 30 minutes long. It may be a little less than 30 minutes long, but it's an extraordinary work. And like you said, I listen to Lex quite a bit. I listen to Jordan Peterson, Ian McGilchrist. I think you and your son introduced me to him.
Yeah.
Um, but C.S. Lewis is one that I always come back to.
Sure.
I watched all 3 Narnia movies this weekend.
Yeah.
Because I've read all the books multiple times through, and they are extraordinary works of art. I mean, so one of the things that I really appreciate about you is I'll send you a little thought that I have that I think is a pretty big thought, and literally 30 minutes later you'll come back with a 40 line response that's extraordinary, right? So do you write automatically like that? Does it just flow out of you? Do you rewrite things? How does that come to you?
I'm very visual.
Mm-hmm.
I'm highly visual. In fact, the way I made it through calculus is I could look at an equation and I could see how it should graph. So if I made a mistake and I ended up, negative when I should be positive, I know that I did something wrong because it was coming out wrong on the graph. So even my math mind is very visual. So
Okay.
as I receive information from you or other people, I am putting it in a place. I'm separating it and putting it in a place in my mind. And so then when I want to respond, I'm just responding as I see it organized. And so it does flow very naturally. I'm just letting you know how I connected the dots as you brought them to me. That's all I'm telling you.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I get what you were saying. So if you look at the relationships then you have in life, and those of us who have 35 plus year relationships like you and I, often can finish each other's statements, right? It just kind of like flows that way. What is it that truly matters in a life well spent? And this is a Lex Friedman kind of a question.
Sure. Yeah. I do resonate with Jordan Peterson on several things, but this concept of working for a greater good. I have my top 5 strengths are learner first, and then strategic, and then maximizer, and then relator, and then positivity. And as I do my work, slogging it through a lot of really difficult situations, I really feel like positivity is a big part of what carries me to apply all my other strengths. Right. But I just feel like your existence should have a positive effect. So I want to maximize that positive effect. I want to be strategic about that. Right. And I want to learn all I can for that positive effect to be realized in the greatest way possible. And it's surprising to me how some things that may have been perhaps a little bit of a discipline can still have great effect. And the story that just jumps out to me is we had a judge here in town, in our county, who had been a district court judge, and he was ready to retire. And he had an administrative assistant working for him who had like 23 years working for him. And so I had picked up a case where a young man grew up around Laramie, Wyoming, and his parents were a couple of hippies and off the grid, and they didn't get birth certificates, and they didn't get a marriage license, and they didn't get social security numbers. So here he was 18 and he wanted to have a job. Right. So he couldn't live off the grid like that. He wanted to have a job. So I was going to court with him, and he was actually born in Albany County to the west of us. And but he was living in Oregon, and so he wanted to talk to the judge and see if he could get a birth certificate so he could get a social security number so he could have a job. And real neat kid. And so just a young guy, didn't have the resources and the means to fly back here. And so I said, well, let's try this. This was way before COVID and Zoom, but they did have in the courthouses these video conference links that were set up, and they were strictly for federal cases. But I said, let's see what we can do. Maybe you can go to a federal courthouse near you, and I'll work with the judge's assistant, and let's see if we can set up a means by which you can talk to the judge and the judge can see you without you having to have the expense of flying. So I talked to his administrative assistant, and and she was very helpful and very kind and worked. And, this was all before Zoom and everything. And so
Right.
didn't really know how it worked, but she went in and learned, and I went in with her, and we figured out how to connect the courtroom to Oregon. And there was a lady in the courthouse in Oregon who worked for him. And anyway, pulled it off. Did it. Judge saw him, got it by video conference when video conferencing was just completely unknown in the court systems. And so he got his birth certificate, and therefore he was able to get his social security number. And I just told him, I said, hey, a lot of people worked hard for you. And one of my disciplines is to be grateful and thankful. And I said, there was a lot that went on. I said, you'd really do well to write her a thank you note, because she worked very hard, so you didn't have to fly. And so he wrote it, and he sent it to me, and then I took it into her. And she called me 2 days later, and she was just crying. And in 23 years of public service, serving in a courtroom, that was the first time anyone had ever thanked her. And she was ready to retire because her judge was retiring. And I was stunned by that. Because you would think something is what I consider to be normal and natural, and even a discipline, you should be thankful, you should say thank you, you should say please. Just some normal, adequate things would have hit her more times than right at the end of her career. And I was so glad that I helped that young man do that. Right. But the world was a better place that day, and her world was a better place that day. And I was so thankful that we ran across this case, and she got thanked before she was done. I was grateful that she was acknowledged in that small way. And it wasn't a gift or an award or anything. It was a thank you card. And she was weeping on the phone. And that has really stuck in my mind over the years. When people serve you, when people interact with you, when people, you're dealing with them, even if it's not a perfect transaction, you can still be grateful. You can still say thankful. You can still show appreciation for what they're doing with you and for you. And I'm shocked at how often it's a complete surprise. And that's not good. Our community would be better if more people were more automatically kind and treating each other with dignity and respect, and acknowledging their service and their work. Even if they're paid to do it, they still need to be acknowledged. And so that's part of our heart.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I told you about Carl Hammerschlag. Carl was a psychologist who worked with the Native Americans I think in the Phoenix area, but in the reservations around there. He was a Jewish gentleman, wrote several books, the Dancing Healer and Theft of the Spirit, and some really powerful books about how to think differently, which I think he learned from the Native Americans that he was going through. But he was a part of, I cannot remember the guy's name. Remember the clown? I'm not going to remember his name. There was a movie where Robin Williams played that clown. Anyway, the point is that the whole purpose of being a clown for this group was to bring joy into difficult situations.
Sure.
Because in joy, in laughter, we get beyond ourselves. Even when people are terminally ill,
sure.
Laughter and joy can assist them in accepting where they are, and then moving through that experience in a way that's powerful and real.
And that's important. I think, to sum up your question, a meaningful life is transcendent. Yeah. And, if you can find a way to transcend the mundane parts of life and pull down into it, everlasting, eternal joy and hope and peace, if you can pull that into it, then your life has meaning that's truly impactful. And, I talked about this one encounter where we bring in gratitude. It's not that, like your mother tells you better say thank you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about transcending the event for another person and their greater good. And together you're something beyond yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Well, I think, Bryan, this has been an awesome conversation for people to get to know you better. I hope that I've done justice in asking you the right questions to help people to get to know you better. I love my interactions with you, and I appreciate you. And there's a proverb that says that there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother, and I think you're truly the personification of that for me. And I hope I am for that for you as well.
Well, I feel the same way, Michael, and yeah. It's love that causes us to make contact every day, and it's love that makes me excited to hear from you and what you're doing. and to experience your mind at work and what you're doing to help other people and what you're learning from them. It's part of what makes my life rich and full and satisfying.
Yeah, and mine as well. Well, for those of you who are just tuning into this session, we're actually going to do part 2, which will be a growing solutions show. And Bryan, what are we going to be talking about in that show?
Well, in that show, I've had this experience of dealing with families that are in crisis and couples that are separating, and then also dealing with a lot of child clients. I represent minors, and it struck me that I don't think that people stop and think about what are they looking for in a lifelong partner. And I resonate with, I enjoy Lex Friedman's podcast, and he almost always asks, how do you find the love of your life? And different people give different answers, but I think there's more to it than maybe meets the eye. And there are also some basic steps that you can take to help identify that person and what they look like, and for sure what they don't look like. And I've gone through that exercise with my granddaughter and really enjoyed it and found it to be insightful.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about that, and then I'll weigh in with some of the things that I think and have been noodling on for 30 years. So I'm looking forward to that conversation too. So Bryan, thanks very much for joining me on Growing the Next Version of You. You're definitely pushing those in your life to grow every day. So I appreciate you, love you, and I'll talk to you soon.
I'm honored to be here, Mike. I love you too.
All right. Thanks very much. And folks, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye. So folks, welcome to Growing Solutions with Mike Rochelle. I'm joined today by one of my oldest friends, Brian Rogers, who's a lawyer in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And he came to me with an interesting question the other day about how I would address something. So Brian, why don't you kick it in and say, talk to me about the conversation that you had with your granddaughter, and then how we might work together to help people to resolve how to have a happier life and how to have a more powerful union with another individual.
Sure. Well, first of all, I can't help but comment because you've mentioned that I'm one of your oldest friends. I'm really only just 59. I think we have one of your oldest friendships. I trust you have people that are older than me in your life, but I love what they told Willie Nelson at his 75th birthday. They said, Willie, you don't look 75, but we remember when you did.
Yeah, well, I think you and I, somewhere between 9 and 14, we started going to church together in Houston, Texas. So I don't know that we've ever figured out exactly which year that was, but it's been. I turned 59 in December, so I think at least 39 years, 45 years, something like that, somewhere between there, that we've known each other and gotten along most of the time.
Sure. Yes. Well, part of being this age means I get the honor and privilege of being a grandfather. And as a result of that, I care a lot about my grandchildren and think a lot about them and their futures and what this world will look like for them and what they will look like for the world. So in my work, I practice as a mediator, and I do work helping families solve solutions, couples that are separating or getting divorced, contractors that are splitting up, family businesses that are ending, and brothers and sisters having to resolve disappointment and conflict, landowners that are next to each other and having to resolve things. But it occurred to me as I've done work as a lawyer for people whose relationships are ending, that as I speak to people, many times there was just no process at all to finding the love of their life. And so I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and Lex Friedman is someone who I enjoy and listen to quite often. And one of the things he'll almost always ask each person he's interviewing, no matter what their level of expertise is or what the rest of the conversation is, he'll almost always say, how do you find the love of your life or your best relationship? And it occurred to me that question is really not answered and not considered. People go to the local watering hole or go to a bar, or they just make contact with people and then relationships get formed, but they're not asking, questions about the other person. So every summer I go up to northern Minnesota with my son-in-law and with my granddaughter, who's now 13, and we drive from Wyoming to Iowa to Des Moines and then head north all the way almost to Canada and go fishing for a week. And I realized I had a captive audience in my granddaughter. So I wanted to help her ask questions that might help her identify who would be an appropriate lifelong soulmate for her versus just allowing time and chance to take that process.
Sure. So, so interestingly, so then we're in is it Minnesota?
Minnesota, yes.
We're in Minnesota. Were you fishing?
Or Minnesota, right? So I had a history there in Orr. When I was in college, I went up there and worked at a camp on Pelican Lake in Orr, and did that and really enjoyed it and made some lifelong memories. And a lot of the people my age that I knew went up to that camp as well. And in the meantime, my son-in-law, when he was 12, the last year I was up there was the first year he went up there, and he had a family tradition of going to Orr, Minnesota and going fishing. And so when he married my daughter, he was saying, hey, you know, every summer we go on this trip, and he showed me this picture, and I go, I know where that is. And he couldn't believe it. So my grandmother Draper had a saying that all the pennies in a bag shake together. And so we just laugh that we both had history from the same place, and we renewed it. And now we go every year, and it's just a wonderful part of every summer.
That's awesome. So yeah, so I actually was able to go there when I was a teenager. Never went there when I was in college, but it was a beautiful place. So you're driving from Wyoming to Minnesota, and you're talking about things. So how did you enter into this conversation with your granddaughter, and why did you think to bring me into this conversation as well?
Yeah, so I told her, you know, she's in the back of the truck. I'm riding up front with her father and my son-in-law, and we take turns driving, and we go straight through. So it's just heading down the interstate. And what I did was I got cardstock, business card size pieces of paper of cardstock with nothing printed on them, and I got a handful of them and took them with her. And I said, okay, you're going to have a talk with your papa, and we're going to talk about boys. And so, you know, she's 13 and starts giggling and whatnot. And so I had different colored pins, and off we went. So I gave her 10 cards or so, maybe 10 or 12. And I said, I want you to write down what you're going to look for in a boy. And so she's like, but she's also thoughtful. She's a very, very thoughtful young lady. And she considers things. This would be my son-in-law's daughter. So when my daughter married him, she was a baby. The granddaughter was a baby. So she's not biologically my granddaughter, but in every other way she is.
Sure, your granddaughter, yeah.
Sure, yes. So I had to write down, think of the things you would think. And I thought she would do, you know, what a lot of people do, you know, good looking, strong muscles and all that kind of stuff. And she was actually very thoughtful. So I gave her a blue pen, and she wrote down things like hardworking, wants to achieve things, will support me in my goals. And I'm like, wow, you know, we're a long way down the road on this. And so she wrote down a bunch on cards, and I said, pick your top 5. And so she said, okay. And she picked her top 5. And then I gave her a red pen, and I said, I want you to turn over your cards, and I want you to write down the exact opposite of what you wrote on this side. What's the opposite of what you're looking for? And so she wrote down, you know, only interested in his stuff instead of supporting her, and instead of hardworking, you know, plays video games and all the time. And so she just wrote little phrases, and we went through that. And so she had the top 5, and she wrote down the opposites. And I said, okay, of those 5, how many of those would be deal breakers, that if this was one of their traits or qualities, you wouldn't want to be involved with them? And she looks and she goes, all of them are deal breakers, Papa. And so I said, okay, well, that's good to know. So let's turn it back over to the blue side. And we went back to the blue side. And then we had a conversation with her father and I, and we said, how would you recognize this trait? You know, if you want to know if someone's going to support you in the things you want to do and achieving your goals, how would you find this out in a boy before you had a relationship with him? So she was thinking it over, and she goes, well, maybe I would share with him what I want to do and see if he'll be interested in supporting me. And so some of them, she couldn't come up with anything right away, but we were talking about different situations that would identify different characteristics. And one of the things we talk about, you know, in Wyoming, we do a lot of hunting and fishing and camping, and we're outdoors. It's just outdoors everywhere here. And so we all know that when you go out and you go camping for 3 or 4 days with someone, or hunting for 3 or 4 days with someone, you learn a lot about them, and you find out what they're about when they're out in the woods. And so she agreed that, you know, you could learn a lot about someone if they were all out in the woods and you had to get up every morning and build a fire and make food and take camp up and down, and how would you approach hiking and going to different places. So we talked about that, and she was just pondering it and thinking about it, and that was part of what I was hoping to get her to do. Just think about, how would I recognize the things that I want and appreciate in another person. And then we turned it over and we looked through the red cards, the red side, and we said, okay, how would you recognize this? And that was a lot easier. I mean, she could just bang, bang, bang. If he was like this, then, I would see that. And I said, well, would you learn to look for that? And she would say, okay. And then we were probably into Iowa, maybe almost all the way to Des Moines. And we stopped for gas and we got out at a gas station. And I said, take your cards. And she said, okay. And I said, throw them up in the air. And so she threw them up in the air and they landed on the ground. And I go, how many are red and how many are blue? And she goes, well, 3 are red and 2 are blue. I said, you just took somebody you don't know home from the bar. And I said, yeah, I don't know what you're getting. And I said, how many of these red ones would be a problem? She goes, they all would. I wouldn't want any of this. I said, okay. So before we get involved with somebody, we need to find out what they're about, and you need to think about that. And she said, good. And then we went through another process where I said, okay, now we've done all this and we've had fun. What do you think if your dad were making out the cards for you? What would your dad write anything different? And honestly, he was really impressed as well. And he goes, I don't know that I would write much different, but I thought maybe if she was saying I want a tough guy or a hot guy or something like that, he might cross that out and put something different. But her questions were pretty thoughtful. And so then I said, okay. And she has a little sister who's 2 years old and 2 to 3, and she just loves her and adores her. And I said, so if you're for your little sister, how would you change any of these cards if you were trying to find someone perfect for her? And so she thought about it, and she goes, well, maybe she's a little different for me. And one of the things she put down as well, I recall, was she said intelligent. She didn't want to marry a dummy. She wanted to have someone that she had could have good conversations with, and she thought that maybe her sister might want someone a little more creative than just brainy, and so she could see those differences. And so we went through that process, and then I said, okay, now let's talk about just you as a couple. What if you were Queen Elizabeth and you've been crowned and you're going to be over the country and all of England and all its possessions, and then your children will be ruling? Would you make out this list any different? And she said, wow, that's a different question. And so she was thinking through that. And then I talked to her in terms of one of the things I appreciate about Jordan Peterson is just working for the greater good. And I said, okay, if you two are going to be together and you're going to work for the greater good of your community, you're going to make the community a better place. Are there things that you would want to have on those cards that he has that you would for sure like to see there? And so then it became a question, not so much of, what are my personal preferences, but then it became a question of, hey, what dovetails well with who I am to elicit good, to create good, to result in good, and then so it's a different question. And I wasn't trying to pin her down or tell her, you've got to find all these qualities in a boy or you can't be in a relationship with him, because she's starting to notice boys. But it was just to develop the thought process. And at that point, I began to think about you and about the training you've given me. I had you come to our church and talk about strengths and training that I know you've shared through your consulting and through your advice to companies. And I said, okay, that has to be a part of this equation. That if you're truly saying, I'm going to lifelong partner with someone to do things that will satisfy my soul and who I am and allow me to express all I can be, then that conversation should be a part of how the relationships develop. What are my strengths? What are your strengths? How do they complement each other? How do they support each other? And so that's when I called you and I said, Mike, I think there's a conversation here that is very relevant, because I think it's easy for people. In fact, I was just talking to a girl who's 21, and she's got a little baby, and they're just a Western couple. She's a cowgirl, he's a cowboy. They have a baby now, and they're separated. And she just found him, and then thought she had found another boyfriend, but it didn't work out. He wasn't who she thought she'd be. And as I talked to her, it was clear that she did not necessarily think she really deserved the best person and a lifelong mate. And I really tried to talk to her and say, you know, let's just shoot for the stars. Let's just say you're going to live the best life you can live, and you want to do it with the best person you can be with. And who would that be? And can you think of it in those terms? And she really struggled. And I think a lot of people struggle to think of themselves in that way as really deserving the best fit for life. They're just trying to find, a relationship. And so, in personal relationships and business relationships and how teams are put together, I don't think we're asking that question sometimes because we don't really think we deserve it. So I said to her the same thing. You've got a little sister that you love. Yeah. What do you want for her? And then so she just lit right up and started rattling things off. And I said, okay, can you fight for that for you as well? Can you fight for you to have the best? And what I see is that people, for one reason or another, have never had this conversation with themselves to prepare them for conversations with someone else. But when I do have the conversations with them, they light up and they realize, hey, wait a minute, there's something to this. And, Lex keeps asking all his guests, what's this all about? And people answer it. And I know it's popular for a lot of people. So how do you frame that question?
Yeah.
What are the answers you look for? And I just believe that when you consider not only strengths, but what are the components of a lifelong, satisfying, joyful life, there are questions to be asked and questions that you can look for answers for that would help. And that's where I thought you came in, and that's why I gave you the call.
Yeah. So phenomenal conversation with your granddaughter. I mean, first of all, and I look forward to meeting her someday because she sounds like she has a lot going on.
She is a great kid.
Much like all your kids do. So interestingly, so the way that I think about this is systematically and leveling it up, right? So I'm obviously a Christian. Everybody that knows me knows that pretty quickly, typically. But I also know that there are many other folks that have multiple faiths and belief systems. So I kind of try to level it up, right? Sure. Always in everything that I talk about. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to walk you through the model that I've created. Now, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and there are
Sure.
probably hundreds of authors that have contributed to this identification. Maslow being the primary author. More recently, Jordan Peterson, Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan. For just years back, we're talking about John Maxwell and 7 Habits. What was that? Covey,
right?
Lencioni, and the writers of Crucial Conversations and the writers of Strengths-Based Leadership and the Gallup organization. So there's a lot of different influences that I have. But before I go through the model, I want to talk a little bit about kind of how I come to this. So the program that I grew up and learned how to teach other leaders was called the Regional Learning Forum. And it was a construct that Dick Dooley of the Dooley Group put together. And I'm fairly certain that it came from experiences that he had at the Aspen Group, which is a think tank in Aspen that exists to this day. And that's why it was called a learning forum, right? So leaders are learners is kind of the idea that he had. And one of his friends was Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler was the author or the editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And also one of 2 people, I can't remember the other guy's name, but that were responsible for the Great Book series, the Great Books, right? And out of the Great Books, and all of these books were Western thought books. And they created a book called The Great Ideas. And the Great Ideas all came out of the Great Books. And it was sort of like, if you've seen I don't remember the guy's name anymore, but I remember the movie. Who was the Braveheart guy that you talked about earlier?
Mel Gibson. William Wallace, right?
Wallace, yeah. So Mel Gibson played Wallace in the movie, but Mel Gibson also played the guy who was the author of the Oxford Dictionary. So it was the first time that somebody put together a dictionary, and he was a Scot, I believe, and he actually put together a team of academics who read all of the great books of the day, and then they took words that had not been added to the dictionary yet. And so that's kind of the way that they did it. Literally manually, they would read these books and then highlight words and say, hey, do we have this word yet? No, we don't have this word yet. Let's put it in there. And so Mortimer Adler and his team back in the day in the 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s, read all of the great books. And then as they would come across an idea, they would cross-reference the idea among all these great books. And the great ideas was the deal. And one of the ways that we thought of things in the Regional Leadership Forum was that you had to think of ideas and then try the ideas on. And it wasn't that you were necessarily buying the idea, but you had to think of the idea. And in this opening of yourself, you were learning how other people thought, right? So I started going down that path, and then I realized, no, wait a minute, in the information technology space, which I've been in for 35 years or so, we have a lot of folks that are not Western, right? We have a lot of Indians, we have a lot of Eastern Europeans who are not necessarily Western from their perspective; they're Eastern Orthodox, right?
Right.
So if we just stick to the great books and the great ideas, we're only looking at Western thought. And although I believe, as I said in our growing the next version of You show, that the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian values that we've created have really forced a ethos and a culture and a way of being that is significantly better and or has moved the world, that it is significant. But if we don't include the Eastern religions and Eastern thought processes, we're at a loss. So what is the thing that all of these groups agree to? And their virtues. So the Greeks called it virtue ethics, but there are always modes of being that are either good or evil, right? So in Taoism and Taoism, if you will, Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. There's chaos and there's order, right? Mm-hmm. It's the yin and the yang thing. So if we include all of the people groups in the world, if we include all of the religions, there are a great set of beliefs that we all have in common that are both good or their opposites are evil, sort of like the blue and the red cards that you did, right?
Sure.
So there's actually a group called Virtues International, which were primarily driven by the Baha'i people of the Baha'i faith, but they have embraced lots of different faiths, and they've cataloged all the virtues. And there are cards that talk about how you can utilize these virtues. So virtues is the way that I come to character from a universal perspective, so that my Hindu friends and my Buddhist friends and my Baha'i friends and my religions all over can agree that these are ways of being that are most powerful and lead to happiness, right? So that's kind of the foundational perspective that I have. And then if you look at Maslow's...
If I could jump in, Mike, before you move on. What comes to mind as you describe that, you started with the dictionary example, and what are all the words that we use to describe or to articulate or communicate everything we're trying to communicate. Right. But then you move beyond that to great ideas. And what's a great idea? Well, in law, we have our legal history is based on previous cases. We have precedent, and then there are certain cases, and we call them seminal, that's the same root as semen, in that they engender a whole life, a whole set of additional cases that were drawn from this original case. And so when you describe great ideas or virtues, they are things that are seminal. Not all ideas are seminal. And when I impart an idea or a virtue to another person, right, it won't necessarily elicit anything from someone else, but a seminal idea, a great idea, good or bad, will have many children. It will have many things that are derived from it. Right. And so that we use the descriptor of virtue to disseminate between ideas that are for good, but there are also great ideas that are for evil and have many children that are evil and they're destructive and they bring death by their nature. But the idea of being able to communicate to someone else a virtue, it should resonate worldwide because it should produce in that person it should be a seminal idea that would produce derivative thoughts and concepts and ways of being that they can also relate to. And so I appreciate what you're saying there.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. So interestingly, I have a document that I put together because you told me I needed to, called the Rochelle universe, right? It's sort of my way of being from a business perspective. And it significantly relies on Christian faith as a way of describing what it is that I want to be and do in the world. To
Sure.
your point, to make a difference, to grow things rather than break things. And as I was going through it with a friend of mine who happens to be Muslim, I went to his naturalization ceremony over a decade and a half ago.
Mm.
He's from Pakistan.
Mm.
But as I was going through my definition of how I look at the world in a very specific way, which I won't bore you with now, pretty much everything that I said, he had a reference to in the Hindu, in the Muslim faith, in the Quran. And I've had the same conversation similarly with Hindu friends who have a very similar experience. As a matter of fact, in the Begotten Veda, a lot of the things that Krishna says are almost identical to things that Christ said in the New Testament, right? So and I'm not saying that I am a Hindu or I am a Muslim or I am Sikh or I am anything other than who I am from a cultural perspective, but I can appreciate that we have more in common than we have in difference in reality, right? And if you are humble enough to listen to what the other person has to say in the conversation, then you can learn where those commonalities come from. And I think that is a path for your granddaughter and for any person of any faith to understand, right? Is that if you understand what people's core virtues are, the things that make them tick, and from where they come, then it's easier to understand what those blue and those red things are going to be in the cards
Sure.
as they look through life. So character is the driver, right? It becomes it becomes what we think and how we behave. It becomes our habits, it becomes our character, and then it becomes our essence in life, how we actually deal with other people. So I'm going to go back here. So if you look at this, so foundationally, we are character. We stand for something, right? And I don't know exactly how this applies specifically to the mate issue, right? Which is even more intimate than most other relationships. But if you understand somebody's foundational character, you can understand what you can expect them, how you can expect them to behave. And I think behavior then becomes the path from which all of the fruit comes out, what their life is going to produce. And then
not only actions that are intentional, and I think this is where it gets critical. Most people in a happy, healthy environment, or we talk about the honeymoon period.
Right.
Hey, they're happy enough, and those parts of their character that maybe aren't exactly what they desired aren't a big deal because they're happy and moving along. But then when you face financial crisis or personal crisis or the death of a child or something like that, it's the reaction that is character born. How do you handle something that hits you out of left field? How do you handle a twist and a turn that you never thought was coming? That's when we find out what virtues we have embraced, right, and what is really a part of us versus, what does life look like when everything's working well? And that reactionary product is vital to know, because no one has a trouble-free life.
That's right. So part of this is developed from Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? So his hierarchy starts at physiological. So the physical and mental health part is kind of the place where Maslow begins. I add character because I think character is more of a spiritual or a heart thing, right?
Sure.
Than a manifestation. Now you manifest that which you are. So that's why I think of it as spiritual.
Right.
I'm not a academician as far as how you define these things. So I'm trying to look through all of the literature that I've read over 30 years and kind of define it in that way, right?
Right.
But Maslow starts at physiological and basically says if you don't have shelter and you don't have food and you don't have water, then you're not going to be able to move forward. So I add that together with mental health. So There's a physical part of who we are, but there's also the mental part that we have to deal with. So we're getting into body and mind at that point. And then from a business perspective, this is where I start with businesses, which is knowing yourself and your strengths. So the other stuff is foundational. It exists, and in an individual level, you can coach folks in that regard. But where we hit the road and where we start impacting others, I think, is knowing yourself and your strengths, and then building strong relationships, right? And
Right.
what the strong relationships is knowing themselves and their strengths too, right? So it's like the first part is, and I think you said the other day that Jordan Peterson says that answering Lex Friedman's question about how do you know who's right for you? What did Peterson say?
Well, he said that's a dumb question. What you need to be asking is how can you be what's right for someone else and
That's
do
right.
that work?
That's right. So foundationally then, if you know your character and you have good physical and mental health and you know yourself, which in a lot of cases people don't know themselves. They're driven by the winds of current of something external to themselves. But if they really know themselves, then they're somewhat immune to that. And if they know their strengths, they know how they can be most best useful in the world. And that's a Gallup strengths kind of a thing, right? It also can be Myers-Briggs or DISC or anything else. But the point is that you know who you are and you know how to get the best out of yourself. My leadership brand is Leadership In. And I call it Leadership In because in is the next. So it is who you are today and who you are tomorrow. And Peterson is the one that says that in his first book or his second book, the 12 Rules. He talks about knowing, growing to the next version of you every day, right? Becoming that which you are becoming better than you were yesterday. And that's how you should judge yourself, not judging yourself to others, but judging yourself to you. And are you becoming something better every day? So I take that from that and other references.
Right. And I like that, on that level, you say strong relationships. You don't just say relationships. I mean, we have relationships that are terrible or draining or wearying or demanding that are not strong relationships. And we have weak relationships. And I help a lot of people when I mediate. And part of my investment in my granddaughter is to say, okay, what are the components for you that would develop a strong relationship? So when you talk about foundational character and virtues, well, at a minimum, if you're going to be in an intimate relationship with someone, it's almost universal that they don't want them to be in a relationship with someone else at the same time. It's just worldwide. That's a problem. Exactly. And so those virtues are easily overlooked because we just say, well, what do I want? I want a relationship. I want a soulmate. I want a lifelong boyfriend or girlfriend, and I want someone, to be there with me. Well, who though? You want a strong relationship, and it's the strong part that we sometimes miss, I think, because we're concentrating mostly on relationship because we don't want to be alone. But that doesn't solve the steps underneath. That doesn't identify the steps underneath. And some people are lucky enough to find a strong relationship, and some people aren't, and it's bitterly disappointing. And the consequences are just legion when that level isn't met.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things that you can do to build strong relationships, and basically one of the things that I teach here comes from Crucial Conversations, which the writers of Crucial Conversations were all parts of the Covey organization back in the day when Stephen Covey was alive and thriving, and they went and they created Crucial Conversations. And Crucial Conversations is about how to have difficult conversations when there are high stakes, strong emotions, and differences of opinion, which is just about every conversation that you have.
Sure.
With every client, right?
Yes.
But what I'm hoping is that if we can build this model so that people can have crucial or fearless conversations in those strong relationships, that they can understand how to have the conversation without the acrimony, that they can forgive people for doing things that they've done, and then they can move forward in gratefulness, as you were talking about earlier, into that relationship, regardless of what level of relationship it is.
Help me understand this from your experience and your expertise, because you talk about, I enjoy who you are. You'll say that often to people, who you are. And for a lot of people, they feel like that's fixed. That's a fixed entity. But as I work my way up the pyramid and we go from strong relationships to knowing your capabilities and on upward, what, sometimes a gal will find a guy and he's got a couple of problems, but she believes she can help change him. And then sometimes there's a guy and he's involved in a gal and it's not all ideal, but I can help change her. How much of it, from your perspective, is fixed, or is there always the possibility to build a relationship that can have big dreams and goals, from your perspective?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is that, so we have, and I think psychiatry pretty well says somewhere between 5 and 12 years old, our personality is fairly set. But personality is the way that you do things in the world, right? So the cool thing about the way that Gallup looks at it is that you have somewhere between 10 and 14 strengths that are your core way of being in the world, of the way of doing, the way of impacting the world. And you only have somewhere between 4 and 8 lesser strengths, or as everybody else in the world calls it, weaknesses. Right? So what you can do is you can mitigate the weaknesses, because you have to not be a drag, right? But you can deal with those weaknesses in a couple of different ways. And I have these conversations. I'm having 27 of them this week with a client and all of their individuals that are coming to classes. The first thing is that if nobody has told you that weakness has bothered them, you don't have to worry about it, because it's not something that's getting in your way, right? If you have a weakness, which is a lesser strength that is getting in your way, there are 2 ways to deal with it. Number one, you can create it using your strengths, because you are a sentient being. You are a thinking, thriving, growing individual. And we know that plasticity of the mind now goes through your whole life, right? Ian McGilchrist lays this out very, very clearly. We are not stuck with who we are, right? We can continue to grow until we're not part of this world anymore. And then finally, if you have a weakness that's getting in your way, you can partner with somebody who has that as a strength. And either, and the way I think about it is, if you are a leader, you're going to have weaknesses. Everybody has weaknesses, but there are people on your team that have that as a strength. Well, ask them to do those tasks to be that which they would love to be, right, in your stead. And then as you're watching them, or as you're involving them in resolving issues that have to do or could use their strengths, then you can adapt the way that they are. We are plastic forever, right? I even think that this is an eternal thing, but that's another conversation for another time, because I think we're going to continue to be learning, because there's so much to know that we don't know. There is so much that we don't know that we don't know, that it's humbling, right? It should be. So as long as we're a humble individual and we're striving forward, we can continue to grow, and we're not stuck. We are not. A lot of people, and I'll name it, especially deliberatives, have an issue with being pegged with who they are, because they don't want to ever have somebody say that they're just this. Okay, well then don't just be that. Be that plus. And then if you learn more about how to grow, then you can do that as well. So that's the way I come to it. Does that make sense?
So as you look at it, and people in an intimate relationship where they're looking for that lifelong partner to move forward with, you may get to the next step above strong relationship and know your capacity, and you may know within your capacity your limitations. But from your perspective, are there any virtues, if a person's ungrateful, or are there any virtues that would be on the bottom foundational layer that a person cannot absorb? Is there enough plasticity to embrace any virtue that might be identified in a crucial conversation?
So I don't have positivity as one of my top strengths, but I do have optimism. And I would say that as long as the person is willing to grow, that they can overcome any issue that they have, right? Where it becomes difficult is that if you have a partner who is striving to become together, and you have an individual that is not willing to grow together, they're recalcitrant in their approach on life, that becomes more difficult, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not something that can be overcome either.
But as you work with people, aren't most people coming in with the mindset that the other one isn't going to change? Don't a lot of people think we got problems and nobody's going to change, and then you're helping them see that they can?
Well, this is where I would agree with Gandhi, which is that you have to be the change, right?
Mm.
You have to be the one that does it first. And if the other individual in the relationship never goes there, I think there are some 7 levels of trust that you can develop, right? So you know where you stand with that individual, and you know how they're specifically going to respond in most situations. So then it becomes your job to be the more emotionally intelligent person to move the relationship forward, right? But you can't do it for them. They're going to have to do it, and maybe in certain arenas they're not going to do that. But as an eternal optimist, I think that there's always a reason to strive forward, to give as much as you can. And then something you said earlier, I thought to say, is that there are individuals in life that you'll run into that are mostly negative and mostly taking, and you have to put boundaries around your life, a bubble, if you will, that protects you and your family from that individual if you have to. But by and large, I always strive first to be positive and opening, and then only then, if it's impossible to move forward with an individual, then you can create a path by which you can thrive yourself, but you may not be able to continue that relationship.
So are crucial conversations more for identifying need or more for identifying blind spots, or is it both?
So I'd say that the crucial conversationalist, who is the driver of the conversation, has the most open way to create value in the relationship as possible, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a fact-based approach to whatever the problem is that they're trying to solve, and they're trying to fill what they call the pool of shared meaning with those facts, and they're trying to elicit with the same energy and passion that they have for their own ideas from the other individual that which they believe are facts that need to be considered as you move into problem solving. So you said earlier that you do a lot of problem solving. The whole idea behind crucial conversations is that we understand what the facts are that we're bringing, what the facts are that they're bringing, and then create a path forward that we can both agree to. So it's a mediation of a situation, whatever that situation is, either be it in a family context or be in a cultural, familial perspective about how we resolve to move forward with certain things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. As you move up the pyramid, you get up to, know your capacity, right? That's what the one above, strong relationships. Know your capabilities.
So knowing capabilities, and I love everybody. And I've literally said this to CEOs, where they're saying, well, what do you think about my team? And I'm like, well, I love them all. And what I'm saying is I love who they are. I love their strengths, and I love their character. I don't necessarily deal with capabilities, but a capability is something that you are good at doing, right?
Sure.
So it's separate from personality, which is the knowing yourself and your strengths. It's separate from relationships, which is how do we negotiate, how we move forward. It's actually what you do, and there's a whole cadre of people that do that work, right? But you have to know what you're good at. In the book Good to Great, it talks about you have to know what you're best in the world at, what you're the most passionate about, and what you can make money at, right? And where those 3 things come together, that's your capability. And so that's what folks have to know for themselves, and for business partners, what capabilities they're bringing into the situation.
Sure. In a relationship for my granddaughter, if she identified her strengths, are there certain strengths that work well with other strengths to accomplish big dreams and goals? Like, my first 2 are learner and strategic. So part of what my wife had to learn was I need to be learning. I need to have time to learn, to have soul satisfaction in every day. And so she makes that a priority for her. And I think, she's got strategic in her top 5. So I think she's strategically managing that proclivity in me. But as you look at strengths, I think of the gardening book, tomatoes love basil, right? They always say plant basil near your tomatoes. Are there certain strengths that pair up well with others to accomplish big dreams and goals, or necessarily?
Well, so this is the universal question has always been, is leadership learned or is it innate? I think it's learned. I think in some people it is innate, right? There are strengths that lead you towards leadership or things like that. But when it comes to goals and dreams, it's a universal need, regardless of what your strengths are. So
Sure.
I don't think that anybody is handicapped, and I don't think anybody's advantaged necessarily, because regardless of what you dream or the goals that you set, you still have to influence others. You still have to have relationships with others, and then you still have to execute on whatever it is that you're dreaming. So I don't think so, Brian. But I'd be happy to understand if there are those that believe that there are.
Maybe one better example is that my third is maximizer, and then my wife Julie has developer, and she's a lifesaver for me because there's times when I just want to go in and be a maximizer, and she's telling me, "Hold on, slow down, wait a minute. There's value here. We can get going," and I'm ready to just move on because I'm not seeing progress. And she's thinking, "Hey, they're getting a great start." And so I see that as a match made in heaven, so to speak, because she's great at helping me be patient, but then she's a developer and she can do the developing. But then when people are ready to kick it up, another notch, I'm right there with her to help them in that way as well. So I don't know. It just feels like there might be some matches of strengths that what would be helpful as people understand who they are to match up well for accomplishing those big dreams and goals.
Yeah. So one of the things that Gallup says, and I'm gonna tell you from a business perspective because that's where Gallup comes at it from, right?
Yeah.
They say don't use strengths as a indicator of fit for a job.
Sure.
So I would think that opposites attract, right? Where Arlene and I are connected is in connectedness, right? I have connectedness number 1. I don't remember which number it is. It's in her top 5, but we diverge from there. So the way that I think about strengths is that whatever your top strengths are is the way that you look at the world, and then the middle strengths are the peripheral vision that you have, and then your lesser strengths are your blind spot. They're literally behind you. So what you're describing is that you have a blind spot that Julie has a primary vision on or a primary view of.
Sure.
So rather than say, in my way of thinking, rather than say there are certain things that are better matches than others, I would say that the people that are willing to listen to others who have diverging views or opinions on things, the happier they're going to be, the more content they're going to be, because they're going to be able to get along with more different kind of people. Does that make sense? And I have maximizing number 2. So you have it number 3. That's where you connect as well. And I definitely want to get things done, right? That's
Sure.
But there's also too fast, too much, too hard that we can do. So we have to listen to our mates, and we have to listen to others who have diverging ways of being and ways of visioning things, because they have goals and dreams too. So it's the coalescence of those between 2 people in your example, or in a team, which is multiple people, where you have to open yourselves to that possibility that somebody knows something different than you, and there's humility in that.
Right, which is a virtue. I think virtues probably are the glue that puts that together. I was thinking down south. I grew up in the South, and there used to be the country preacher says, when you're dating, opposites attract. When you're married, opposites attack. And so, but what's the difference? Maybe you're a little more virtuous toward those opposites when you're dating. And if you maintain that virtue in the relationship, perhaps it doesn't matter what's on the other side if the virtues are there.
Yeah, so I think so. In the dating situation, you also have hormones, and you have other charisma that's happening in the relationship, right? Which over time, and this, I'm not saying anything out of turn. Everybody says it. Over time, those things subside, right? But if you have a match at character and at the foundational ways of thinking of the world, you're in a better place when that subsides. That doesn't mean it's not going to be hard work, because it's still going to be hard work, because you're still two different individuals that have two different ways of being and modes of engagement with who you are, right? What you can hope is that you have mates like you and I who are growing in their own path, and that you're supportive of that path. They are supportive of your path. And then together you continue to grow forward, upward and onward, as C.S. Lewis likes to say.
When I was talking to my granddaughter about, what you put on these cards, does it make a difference if your relationship is going to have purpose, if your relationship is, we use the Queen of England example, if your kids are going to be royalty, or if you're just going to work together for the greater good,
right?
Does it make a difference what you want to see on those cards? How do you see, I notice even on the right on your chart, spirits at the bottom, spirits at the top.
Yeah.
How do you see flowing from your foundational character and your virtues through becoming where your relationship is actually transcendent of itself? It's actually something bigger than just you two making your way through the world, or like a lot of people view it, it's not flowing to you making the world a better place, but it's just us against the world, and you're trying to figure out how to make your way. How do you see those connected and flowing?
That's an interesting question. So I think of, obviously this is a two-dimensional chart, right? But the reason I put spirit at the top and spirit at the bottom is because Maslow, in his hierarchy, ended with self-actualization. So content and happy is the way to think of self-actualization. That's you being the best you can be.
Right.
But you said it earlier, the transcendence part, it's self-transcendent. It's the ability to go beyond oneself and to become something that is of use, not only to yourself, but to your family and to your community and to your work, to your city and to your nation, right? So
right.
It becomes all encompassing. So then I think of it as an infinity loop. So that's why I start with spirit at the bottom, spirit at the top. From my faith perspective, I think of the Holy Spirit filling me with the Spirit and then overflowing with Spirit through my mind and body, and then recycling and being refilled and constantly filled with that Spirit, which outflows love and concern for others and giving and concern and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the way that I come to that. Does that make sense?
Sure. So thinking in an infinity loop and coming through the top, becoming self-transcendent, allowing your relationship to transcend just two people, but to become something bigger. Does that flow back and identify new virtues or create new virtues, or how do you see it cycling back up and through again?
So when you have a couple of people together, the character that you have is enhanced by the character that your spouse has, right? Or your significant other. Ideally, right? It can also be hindered by it, honestly, right? So, I don't know exactly the answer to your question. I think part of this is just experiencing one another in a powerful way. What I would hope that everyone would have is somebody that understands who they are on their good days and forgives them for who they are on their bad days.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a old Jewish principle that the brightest light shines in the darkness, and so the concept there is when you're approached by a dark moment or a dark experience or a dark part of your history, you don't have to settle with the darkness. There is in there a kernel of light to be found and a kernel of truth and ability to be found. And maybe that's part of the commitment to coming. If I'm not just going to exist for myself, but I'm going to be transcendent, even with my mate, I'm going to help reveal their virtues, even when they're struggling or failing. I'm still going to look for and find that light and not just leave the darkness to prevail.
That's a healthy way to think of it. Definitely. Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of the model I put together. I don't know that it's perfect. I can't profess that it is, but what I've developed are 12 different experiences that an individual or a group can go through, like I said, either individually or collectively, to create the good life in themselves. And that's the end in mind, right? Which is to become what you can And I think that kind of flows with the parable of the talents, right? So if you think of what of the parable that Christ laid out, he said that there was a master who gave, I think it was 5 talents to one person, 3 to the other, and 1 to the other. And it was a monetary thing in the example. But I think of talents as what we've talked about, which are the building blocks for strength. So if you're gifted with Maximizer and you continue to work on it and you refine it and you make it the best that you can be with it, and you continue to grow in it, then you're going to grow from 1 to 3 and 3 to 5, right? And whatever measurement, the way you want to think about it. And I think that's a wise way to think of it, because in the example, the person that held on to what they were and weren't willing to grow or to try or to become something different than the one thing that they had it taken away, and they were called a wicked servant, right?
Right.
But they took the 1 and gave it to the person who had 5, who had grown it to 10, right?
Sure.
So everybody is gifted in different ways. Some 1, some 3, some 5. But the whole idea is that we continue to grow throughout life, and I think and I hope that this will continue through eternity as well.
Sure. So perhaps one of those cards would be a commitment to growth and a commitment to becoming.
It definitely is. I mean, so the thing that I learned from Dick Dooley was learn and change, and I just added to it grow. Right. So you have to learn every day. Based on that learning, you have to change how you do things, and then in that we grow, and then it starts over again, because there's more to learn and more to know than we can know, and we'll always have something to grow into.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to make you think. What would you put on your daughter's cards?
Wow, that's a pretty interesting thing. So from my perspective, the things that are the most important in life are to love, to be just, and to be humble. So if you had somebody that had those 3 things, they loved broadly, they held justice as a standard, and they were humble enough to continue to learn, not only from their own experience, but from the experience of others, because that's the less expensive way to learn, right? If you can learn on somebody else's dime, that's the best way. So I think those are the 3 things that I would start with, and that I would hope that they would have.
Sure.
How about you? What are your 3 or more?
I think that there has to be in a couple, and I've wanted this, I've been pleased for my children that they find people that truly appreciate who they are. I mean, just not just tolerate it, but kind of revel in it, and right. Just an appreciation and a gratitude for who they are. It's one thing to marry, someone who's a beautiful songbird. It's another thing to want to put her in a cage. Right. And so, just this value, this deep value for their essence and who they are, and wanting to see that released and shared with the world. I mean, I just am blessed with in-laws. My children have married mates who really want to see the best in my children released and shared, and they share it, and they just truly value it, and it's just so heartwarming. And when I see that not taking place in a relationship, when people they can't even give a measure of respect right. to mate, and they're despising it, it's just a horrifying thing to have someone that intimate in your life that doesn't value you. So that's a big one. And then the integrity, loyalty, to be loyal and to stay, because we all face things that are going to be unpleasant, and we're going to face times when we're asking ourselves, is it worth it? But a loyal person will stick through it and find a way. And then, I have positivity. My son married a young lady with positivity, and my daughter married a man with positivity, and they just always believe there's a way. They find a way, and then they just keep moving forward in a wonderful, beautiful way, so that obstacles don't defeat, but rather they provide an opportunity to build something, and from them come some really memorable, not just memorable, but seminal moments in the family's history where something was worked through and it didn't defeat. Instead, victory came out of it. And so loyalty, just a value and a respect for who they are and wanting to see them share that. And, we're a group that likes to celebrate. And so we celebrate each other, we celebrate life, we celebrate the things that our other people are doing. And so just gratitude in general, I think, is so important. If you can wake up every day and be grateful, you can solve a lot of the issues that'll come at you every day. And if you're ungrateful by habit or proclivity, you've got problems that are very hard to overcome. So I appreciate gratitude as well.
Yeah. I'd add to my 3 forgiveness. I think
Oh yeah.
the program that I went to with you in Colorado talked about forgiveness, that a lot of healing doesn't come because of unforgiveness.
Right.
I think that's a strong virtue, because in order to be forgiven according to Christ, you have to forgive, right?
Right.
So that's a powerful one as well. So the thing about it is, from my perspective, I like all the virtues.
Sure.
And that's the part of having connectedness. Number one, it's like I see all of the possibility, beautiful possibility, and none of the downside. And that's the thing about virtues, is that if you're living according to the things that people groups, religions, and nations worldwide for millennia have agreed are paths to happiness, then that's the path to go on. And if there's something that is agreed to that is a destructive path that is going to lead to heartache and difficulty, that's not the path you want to go down.
Yeah.
But everybody has a choice every day, as Jordan Peterson says, right?
Sure.
It's whether to do right or do wrong. And that's not something that necessarily determines whether we're forgiven or not. But it sure is a lot easier if you're on the path to recovery from the very beginning, by, like I said earlier, learning from other people's mistakes and going in the right way.
I think as I look at it, we're all populating this planet, and then we become divided into different nations or people groups or cultures, and those things divide us. And then within that, people become isolated, and they're divided from their community, and there's all the breakdowns that come down through that. But truly, in this day and age, I see so many people that are just fragmented within themselves. They're just divided within themselves. Their identity is fractured and fragmented. And what you talked about earlier, forgiveness, a person has to have the opportunity to work through reuniting the parts of who they are with someone they love. And if you're around a little child who's 2 or 3 years old, and you do something that's stupid, or you raise your voice, if I'm around my grandkids and I say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, they go, okay. And they just move right on. And they have this incredible ability to forgive. But as we get traumatized and hit by the life, it's those parts of us are broken. And so I think forgiveness, the reason we need to forgive people so we'll be forgiven, is because we're allowing those fragmented parts of our identity to be reformed and remade. And because of that, then we can be reformed and remade. And it's sort of a what's the word, where two things reinforce, a self-reinforcing paradigm. When you live in that forgiveness and you're forgiven, you can just truly leapfrog forward, and you become a whole person. And then from being a whole person, you can live a life that's not only whole, but wholly transcendent. It's truly good. And the goodness comes out because someone who loves you has allowed you to be reformed and that good to come forward. I think that's super powerful.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I think you're going to have quite a bit to talk to your granddaughter about. I think the path that you took on your trip to Minnesota was pretty awesome. I might actually try that with my daughter and my sons as well, because none of them are married yet, and we're not expecting that for a while either.
Well, it happens fast. Boy, you turn around twice and they're all married and you got grandkids.
I know. So, Bryan, it's been a pleasure to talk with you about this. Any last thoughts before we head out and say goodbye to everybody?
Well, Mike, I am grateful for you. I am grateful for who you are and what you bring, because you've learned how to share the best of who you are in your family lineage and your history with others. And that is healing all by itself, just that sharing. But beyond that, you give us some real wisdom and some understanding on how to live life, and great insight. And, insight is about seeing. and seeing is about light. And, where there's light, there's life. And where there's light and life, you can always find love. And so I just appreciate those things about you. I appreciate your contribution to not only my life, but to all the people that I know you work with. And I'm grateful for who you are and for today.
Well, I appreciate that as well. I appreciate who you are primarily, and what you do with who you are. That's the key phrase, right? That I try to use.
Sure.
But I appreciate that affirmation from you, and I look forward to seeing where this takes us and takes the people that listen to it. So God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.
God bless.